Okay, so good morning, everyone. When I looked at my slide for this presentation this morning, which I hope to use to warm you up while the coffee is warming up outside, I was realizing that I'm getting a bit old-fashioned because I'm the only keynote speaker who still uses an email address, but I think we can hopefully work with that. So what I want to go through is actually a project which is different than many other projects in many senses. It's a big project. While many projects are big, it's a project which takes terribly long time to prepare and to run, and a fully distributed project, which is basically the data and storage management for the LHC. And we like to make a difference between data and storage management. Storage management, how do we look after the data once it's in a storage system? Data management, how do we decide where data is going, which data is going where? But I will just explain all of this in much more detail. And if this thing is working, you will see my working place, which is the area around CERN. Well, my pointer I have to give up on. It's not strong enough, but it doesn't matter. So you can see the Geneva area and basically the microscope which we have built to analyze the structure of matter and all these things. But you can see a microscope doesn't have to be small. It's actually a very large instrument. You can see the Alps in the back with Mont Blanc. You can see the Geneva area. The little stretch, which is a bit linear in front of the lake, is actually the airport. And the yellow ring which you are seeing is basically the collider which we are using to analyze what is going on with the constituents of matter. We are doing this by putting very large experiments in several places around the ring. So you will hear about names like CMS, LHDB, Atlas, and there's a third one, ALICE. These are the places where basically the real experiments are happening, and I will show you a little bit more about how this is happening in detail. But what I would like to start off with is why are we doing all this? And I will go back a little bit and explain this in more detail, but you may have heard recently there has been an announcement that actually something came out of the LHC, which is finding a particle which people have been looking for 40 years almost. And what I'm showing here, apart from the pretty pictures, which give you some impression for what our data looks like, these collisions of particles create sprays of other particles which we analyze to derive physics results. But what you're seeing on the right is basically the curves for combined energy of two particles. In this case, in the top case, it's actually single photons which are going outside. And if you just combine various photon pairs, you get like a curve. And the way how we detect particles is by finding little ripples in a flat distribution, which you would get by random combinations, which are actually signaling that there is something which has a defined mass in that area. So, in this object so far, we are calling it compatible with a Higgs boson. This is simply because we cannot tell that what we have found as a particle is really the Higgs boson. We can only say with the data we have at the moment, we know there's a new particle, and we will have to continue to measure what's... that's a better one. Okay. Okay. So basically, you see pretty pictures here, which I used to analyze the data only for debugging, basically. All of the analysis which you're seeing in here, and you see basically curves for a prediction which doesn't have the Higgs particle, which are the green and red lines. And then you see the data points with the errors which we have measured, and you can basically see that the measurement is not cannot be explained by some simulation which doesn't have a new particle there. And down here you have actually a similar plot which is showing how unlikely it would be to get this kind of little bump by just statistical fluctuation. And that by now became pretty unlikely. So we know we have found something there. But on the next slide, I'm showing a slide which is actually coming from our director, which I don't do very often, I have to admit, but it captures a couple of things which are really very important. To build this kind of infrastructure is really a global effort. I mean, there's all of the hardware which has gone into this system, all of the software has been produced worldwide by a large variety of institutions, actually over a long time. Because when I joined CERN in 95 as a little student, the project was already going on, so I came late, if you want, and I will probably spend quite a significant amount of my future career just sitting on this one project. So it's a big effort, it's a global effort, and it's an effort which takes several tens of years. But what has been very important in this iteration for this accelerator was that for the first time, computing has been listed as an explicit tool. I mean, that sounds strange to you as a community, but in the physics area, it was always considered very important to build accelerators. It was always considered to be very important to build the experiments. But computing has been listed, and in particular grid computing, distributed computing, has been listed as one of the 3 items which are required to extract some information out of all the data we are collecting. And that is really true, because the plots which you have seen have been extracted out of roughly 30 petabytes of data only a couple of weeks after the accelerator has stopped to take this data. And this in the past would have taken years, basically. I mean, not for that volume, it was just impossible, but to have this quick turnaround between stopping taking experimental data and extracting something significant out of it, the turnaround time has been really very small. What's quite important is basically now we found something, and many people say, well, that's good, so you did your job, what will you do next year, basically? So it's very important to understand that the press stuff which is coming out is one thing, but the work for the physics people is only starting now. They want to know what kind of Higgs is this, what are the properties of it, are there more of those, and this kind of things. And this will take another 10 to 15 years. So we will collect data and we will analyze data for the next decade for sure. And even after the experiments which are running currently have switched off, we have to still provide the data in a usable form to the upcoming studies which may happen in the future, which is really a problem, because to keep data understandable, not just the byte stream, over 10, 15 years is not an easy task, because the only thing we know at the moment is that if I look back 15 years in time when I started, well, the web was kind of a presentation by Tim Berners-Lee at a little high-energy conference in Annecy, where like 20 people were gathering around his terminal and said, yeah, that's loud, sounds good, basically. And most of the computing infrastructure for this, most of the hardware even to build the accelerator did not exist. People were planning for a project where all the components were assumptions, and you can conclude from this that over the lifetime of the experiments, the same might happen again. Definitely in computing. The only thing we know right now is whatever we use now, it's almost certain that we will not use it in the future, because there will be disruptive changes in many areas, and we have to keep the data in the system available during the whole period while we are integrating new technologies. Okay, let's go back a little bit. A few words about CERN. So CERN has actually been founded in the 50s, 54, and it's, as mentioned, in Geneva. And you have to realize in this period, 54, this was after the war, and this was basically an initiative to get scientists which didn't talk to each other for a long time, because they were working on various secret projects for their countries, to bring them together again in one place. And that's actually one of the reasons why it's in Geneva, because at that time, Geneva was one of the few places where people could even gather without visa constraints and all the rest of these things. So by now, most of the European countries are actually contributing to CERN. They're contributing by their gross product, so big countries contribute more, small countries less. And recently CERN has opened up from Europe to also have quite a few non-European companies which are trying to be member of CERN, and there's some procedure, several countries are applicants and so on. So they want to join. the lab and contribute to its work. The people at CERN are providing an infrastructure, though. CERN is not the place where the research is really happening. This is happening outside in many universities, apart from accelerator research, I should say. But CERN is meant to provide an infrastructure for scientists from the outside to come, to take their data, to get all they need to analyze their data, and then derive their results. But the scientists themselves are not hired by CERN. The staff here is running the infrastructure like the accelerators, the computing, and so on, and with a budget which is shown here, which is significant, but if you compare this to the amount of people which are using this infrastructure and the large community outside is not, I think, not very high, but okay, let's go on. So this map shows you from where the users of CERN are coming, and these are many more countries than actually the member states themselves, which are in blue here. So you see people from all over the world are coming to CERN or using CERN data to make their analysis in very large projects, which we call experiments. When I say the CMS experiment, this is a group of several thousand people from several hundred institutes all over the world. So and we also use the word experiment for the detector which this large group of people is building and then analyzing the data of. But you can see basically all the countries, apart from white spot here, are contributing, and we are working on getting this a bit more filled. Okay, I will not talk a lot about physics, and I don't think I have to, because everyone who has gone to Damien's wonderful presentation about Pearl 6 pretty much knows everything about physics. I mean, you know the Schrödinger equation, you know the Dirac equation. I think I don't have to show any further equations. I will just a little bit go through the standard stuff which people may remember from school. So we have something which we call the standard model, which is kind of a weird name for the current state of the theory. And this model has been derived through a lot of tests and so on, but the standard model contains a small set of particles, actually. So you have the electron, which, I mean, you know definitely as being part of the atom. You have inside the atom a nucleon, and those are made up out of two kinds of quarks, up and down. Fine. They couldn't find a better name. So each of these protons and neutrons has three of these guys inside. And pretty much the blue row here is all of the particles which you typically see if you see any matter. If you look at yourself, you're built out of these few constituents. It's actually very few. There's a couple of others which are listed down here, which are not stable under normal conditions. They appear when you do, for example, an accelerator experiment, or they did appear when the whole universe was started at the Big Bang. And basically this group of few light particles, the leptons, and the group of quarks makes up the whole theory describing everything from microscopic interactions between atoms up to the big cosmological happenings you see if you look in the evening into the sky. There's a few of those particles which are unstable, but which you probably don't know about, but which can be seen also in other contexts than accelerators. For example, the muons. These are particles which are created when, from the outside of the universe, high energetic particles hit the Earth and the atmosphere. And I'm sure you will be very happy to hear that each of you, every second, is crossed by one of them, which just goes through you, may hit a couple of your DNA molecules, and thereby actually makes evolution possible. Without these guys, we would not be here. But some of the other guys are only seen at very high energies. In addition to this few constituents, there's a couple of carriers of force. So, for example, the photons, which we all know because they're part of light, they happen to be the same particle which also binds an electron to the atom. The proton exchanges some photons with the electron and thereby keeps it close. Sounds strange, because how can you exchange a particle and keep somebody close to you? Well, you just have to go back to Damien, you do it backwards in time, and then you're okay. So that's kind of what's happening here. There's other particles which are the carriers of the strong force, the gluons, which bind the quark in one of those nucleons. There's some carriers of the weak force, which is responsible for the radioactive decay. And then there's the gravitons, which don't have a color here because we didn't find them yet, but we still hope to. But the gravitons are very important because they keep you in the seat. So I think that's very important. Anyway, this group of particles makes up the Standard Model, which is incredibly successful in describing all the effects we can see in the world over many, many orders of magnitude. So, well, if we have a Standard Model, what's the problem? Why do we still go on? So that's another picture which is slightly less convincing, because if you look at the matter which we see around us, you can actually see that all the elements we are constructed of, all the material here, makes up for 0.03% of all the matter which is part of the universe. That's actually not very much. And if you look further, there's one class of particles which I didn't go into detail before, the neutrinos, which make up 0.3% of the total mass of the universe as well. That's also not very much. So where's the rest? Probably the stars. No, the stars are actually 0.5%. So all the stars you see around and all the matter in there is only 0.5% of what's around. There's a bit of larger contribution from free gases, which are between the stars, but if you look down here, the largest contribution comes actually from something we call dark matter. It's something which is heavy, but it doesn't actually produce any light, so we can't see it from the outside through telescopes and so on. And dark energy, 70% and 25%. So the largest fraction of the universe is actually made out of something which we don't know. So it's very nice to have a very successful theory, but we can't really claim that we understand what's going on, basically. And these measurements, in case you're wondering where these numbers come from, the dark energy and the dark matter, you can actually deduce from the rotation of galaxies, which tells you how much mass is inside, and from the expansion of the universe, which can be both measured relatively precisely. So there's quite some problems which are still to be solved. Here in text form, some of them, we have a wonderful Standard Model, but nobody without the Higgs process knows which mass the individual particles have. We know a lot about how they interact, but we don't know why is the proton this heavy or why is an electron this heavy. So there's a problem with integrating gravity. Gravity is a completely standalone theory which nobody managed to merge with the other theories which are available in a consistent way. And there's another big problem, because when the universe was created, there's a couple of conservation laws. You can create pairs of particle and antiparticle together out of energy. This is basically what the Einstein equation tells you. But you can only create pairs. So after the universe has been created, where did all the antimatter go? Because we are matter and we don't experience a lot of antimatter, otherwise we would know, because we would annihilate and disappear basically. But it's unclear where all the antimatter went, and there's no convincing explanation for this. And there's a couple of theories which become easier if you add a couple of dimensions, not very intuitive, I won't go into this very much, but together with the problem of what's the rest of the universe, the 95% which we don't know about. So LHC was built, in fact, to work in all these different areas, not just in the Higgs area, which is the most popular because it can be exploited by the press in a short press statement much better. So we will look for all these items, and the way we do it is basically we build a ring which allows to collide protons. So how do we do this? What we take is basically a large almost cyclic ring, which keeps the particles on a certain track. And then we put packets of protons into this ring. They are kept by magnetic forces on track, basically. And the packets contain something like 10 to the 11 protons each little packet. This sounds a lot, but it's actually much less than you would have in a cubic centimeter, which would be 10 to the 23 protons. So but it's a significant amount of them. And then we accelerate them by giving them a kick once every time they're going through the circle. So the acceleration is happening, let's say, in the back, and it's happening by producing a short electric field just in front of the proton, which is pulling it forward exactly at the right point in time, which of course is not completely trivial. And we do this actually so that the packets which are collide 40 million times a second. So we have these 2,000, almost 3,000 packets, and every now and then two of them are colliding. So the collision rate is 10 to the 7, 10 to the 9, fine. These are all numbers. I mean, it's, remember the 40 megahertz, I think that's the best number. And then when those bunches of protons actually collide, what is colliding are actually only 2 protons out of the whole packet, because the probability for 2 to meet is very low, because the density, we are trying to increase it, but you cannot, it's difficult to increase the density between protons because they're actually the same charge, so they will push themselves apart. What is actually really colliding is only one of the 3 quarks of the one proton with one of the 3 quarks of the other proton. And those 2 guys really collide and create a spray out of particles which we then detect and analyze. So I won't go too much into the stuff which is down here, but the important point is most of the interactions which are happening are happening with a very low frequency, because the new stuff, most of the interactions which are happening we know already. So they're described by the current theory, we don't really need more of them. So the new physics rate is estimated to be this frequency, so it's very low. So 40 megahertz on one hand, very low rate of new stuff we are interested in. So this means the event selection is 1 out of this number, 10 to the 13. So you can imagine that's also not completely easy to do. So on the engineering side, talking a bit about the accelerator, so these are the magnets which are keeping the protons on track. There's 2 beams of protons going in opposite directions, so they're both inside this magnet in 2 different beam pipes. They're separated from each other because they actually need the opposite magnetic field to be kept on track, because they go in opposite directions. So, but this infrastructure is built out of superconducting magnets. We need a very strong magnetic field. In order to get this magnetic field, we have to cool down the magnet to a temperature of 1.9 degrees over the absolute zero in order to get rid of any resistance in the magnet. So that way we don't dissipate a lot of energy while we are creating this strong magnetic field. And there's 10,000s of these magnets, some for keeping particles on track, some for squeezing the particles close to each other so that they stay properly aligned in their packets. For all of this, there was 8,000 kilometers of superconducting wire used to produce the coils. And to cool all this down, we need 120 tons of helium, which is actually a lot of balloons, in case you know this from the children parties. That's actually a significant fraction of the world production, so we have to carefully plan to get it. So the whole system is the biggest superconducting infrastructure which is around at the moment. But at the same time, it's a big infrastructure. It's very, the precision we have to run it with is quite incredible, because, you know, you have a 27-kilometer ring, but we are sensitive to small changes in any dimension below a 1 millimeter range. And I can show you a couple of examples. So we actively have to steer and compensate any of those changes, like thermic changes. But we can also see things which are not just because temperature changes. We can, for example, see if the moon is passing by, because when the moon goes over the accelerator, it will actually slightly tweak it a bit. It will lift one leg a little bit, and it will detune it. So we have to actively compensate for this. And it took quite a while until people understood this, because in the beginning, of course, this was just a weird, systematic thing which came back and back again, and then people realized what it was. We also are sensitive to the TGV, the big high-speed train, when it's passing by CERN, or the accelerator better, the back currents which come from basically the electric engine in there, they affect slightly the tuning of the accelerator. Or another quite funny, I think, correlation is we can see the water level in Lake Geneva, because Lake Geneva gets a bit heavier when there's more water. So when there has been a lot of rainfall, the water level rises, and we have a different gravitational distribution around the accelerator, which will also slightly tweak it. So all these elements basically show you it's a large infrastructure, but it has to be steered at a very fine-grained level. A couple of numbers which, I have to apologize, I took them from our press release department, but they're still true. So biggest accelerator, I said already. Fastest racetrack on Earth, well, yes, the protons circulate with almost speed of light. I mean, there's a lot of zeros there. So they are very close to the absolute maximum. It's the emptiest space in the solar system, because the vacuum we have to have in the beam pipes to not disturb the particles is actually 10 times less than, for example, the atmosphere on the moon, which isn't really so strong, I would say. It's the world's largest refrigerator because of the cooling system, which I mentioned already. When we collide particles, we create the hottest temperature in the galaxy, because the energies which are colliding inside there above what you would see in the heart of the sun, significantly. It's the world's biggest and most sophisticated detectors. We'll see a bit more about that. And we are collecting quite a significant amount of data. So last year we collected 30 petabytes of data. And in total, because we are working over all the data which is extracted from the system, we have now 75 petabytes. Just a little history how our community basically was dealing with data analysis. So as I mentioned, it started in the late 50s. The collaborations, the groups of people working together were 2 to 3. God, it must have been a really nice time, but anyway. But they were collecting kilobits. I mean, they were not collecting digital data. They were actually looking at photographs and measuring curvatures from a photographic plate, for example, to identify particles. And by now, in 2010, our collaborations, each of the experiments are size of 3,000 people. They're collecting petabytes. And of course, the whole process of extracting the data, analyzing the data, storing the data is completely digital, and using tape, very important. We are a big tape user, and disk for the analysis. And the progression in this kind of chain of experiments is as dramatic as the computing progression used to be. So we are also responsible for keeping data of old experiments. And the last experiment which happened in the 90s at CERN was called LAB, actually in the same tunnel which we are now reusing for LHC. But the vast data amounts which have created at that time, a few terabytes, now we have to be careful that they don't end up on the tape medium and we lose them in one go, because the explosion in the amount of data people use for the analysis is that big. At that time, it was a lot of data. Now we have to look after it. Okay. What do we have here? Yeah, a couple of numbers of CERN itself. CERN has, to store this data, about 68,000 physical disks. That's what I looked up yesterday. So that's what we are running every day. And the numbers are not actually stable. I have to look it up every day because, as you can imagine, with this amount of infrastructure, this is a fluid system where on one side new hardware is brought in, and on the other side old hardware is moved out, which is one of the challenges of running it. And we have something like 45 petabytes of reliable storage, so mirrored or replicated to keep the data. Okay, let's go back into a bit where the data comes from in detail. So this is showing you a cavern where one of the four LHC experiments is actually located. And you can see it's actually a big place. So this is a digger. The whole hole is, the whole experiment is, not the whole actually, is 55 meters long, 30 meters wide. So it's easily larger than the biggest building which we have for Director General at CERN. So, and while this picture shows you the empty hole, I can tell you if you went into the hole after the experiment has been constructed, there was no space whatsoever. You were standing like this in front of the detector, which is completely filling the whole the whole cavern with electronics, with the different detector components. This is a picture from the early construction phase where you can see some of the big magnetic coils which are creating a magnetic field inside the detector to measure, to create curved tracks for particles which are charged. But I'll come back to that. So what happens is actually we have the collisions of LHC, which are happening in the middle, or almost the middle of one of these big detectors which have been built. And then there's an onion kind structure around it in order to completely measure as many as possible particles which are coming from this collision in the middle. So in the inner part, you typically have what we call tracking detectors. They measure the path of a particle when it flies to the outside in space, but they don't actually interact too much with the particle directly. Towards the outside, we have other detectors which are actually trying to stop the particle in a very massive detector material in order to measure its energy. So outside we get the energy, inside we get a track of the particle which is curved by the magnetic field, which tells us the impulse. Out of the two quantities, you can actually derive what kind of particle it was. Positive ones go this way, negative ones go that way, and the energy momentum ratio tells you what kind of particle this is. So all these detectors here are highly granular, and the individual detector components, these are the 4 experiments which have been built. They all look somewhat similar, at least the 3 of them. They're hermetically close around the area where the collision is, because there's some particles we cannot measure because they're neutral and because they're not interacting with our detector at all. So those ones we have to derive by accounting for all the other ones and conservation laws, because we know the energy has to be conserved, so we can actually tell if something has left undetected the detector because the rest of the energy doesn't sum up, roughly like that. But the important point here for the data part is all these detector components are highly segmented in order to measure precisely in space, and all of them are producing data. So what we typically have is 150 million sensors in each individual of those detectors, and they're taking data with 40 million times per second continuously, because we have this rate of possible interesting crossings happening. So this means you can see each of these devices like a camera, a 150 megapixel camera, which takes pictures 40 million times a second. And as you can imagine, these are 3D pictures, but I mean, fine, that's maybe a detail. But the total amount of data which is produced by just looking at the sensors is really enormous. So I will talk a little bit about what we do with the data. There's a certain hierarchy of processing the data from the raw measurements which we get out of the detector down the chain. And so the raw data which we are getting out of our detector components is relatively simply structured. So it tells us which detector element was hit, I mean in which area was a particle seen, basically, how much energy or what was the impulse, if you want, depending on and at which time, which is very important, because as we are colliding particles very often, it may happen that you see particles at the same time which are coming from different beam crossings, basically from different original collisions, and they don't belong to each other. We have to tell them apart, otherwise we're making a mistake by analyzing the event. But this is the raw data. This is measurement data. It doesn't change. It's the basis for all the analysis. Now, very important, there's a large chunk of data which is not generated by the detector, which is simulated data. So why do we have simulated data? Now, in the end, we want to tell apart between different physics theories. I mean, the theorists on the physics side all come up with new proposals how nature could be behaving, how the current models should be changed in order to improve them. And in order to tell apart between the different theories which are on offer, we're simulating them. So we are simulating a world as it would be if this laws, I mean, if this changes to the model would exist. And then we are processing the results of this interaction through the whole detector. So we are simulating in detail every single particle which has been simulated before at the hard interaction, and pass it through the whole of the detector through every piece of equipment which is there in order to simulate what would be the measurement if this would be true. And this process at the end produces a similar data set to the raw data which we are getting, but for different theories. And what we are doing to some level at the end of the analysis is comparing reality with some of the proposals which come out of the simulation. But simulation plays a very important role and takes a lot of CPU time, as you can imagine, because to simulate each single particle tracking through many thousands of geometric volumes with different material takes quite some CPU. So once we have done this, we have two types of data sets, raw and simulated, which look the same. For the measurement part, the simulated data is a bit bigger because it knows the truth about things. For the measurement, we don't really know, was it really a pion? Was it another particle which just looked like it? The simulation does, because there we generated all the particles. That's another important tool for us to cross-check from simulated data whether we recognize particles correctly, whether the algorithms are working correctly, because in simulated data, we know everything about the origin of the measurement. All this data is then reconstructed, which means that measurements in different parts of the detector are put together. So a little bit of a track in the middle, a little bit of energy in an intermediate detector, and much more energy in the back. We link all this up to form what we call a 4-vector. It's a complete trace of a possible particle with all the measurements combined in a systematic way. We point back to the origin. We group particles which are very close together and form what we call jets, which are just small cone-like areas where you have a lot of particles. And then we try to estimate, in fact, what particle may this have been. And we apply calibrations, because similar as for the accelerator, all of these massive detectors, they are 30 meters big. We are measuring in the middle with the precision of a few microns. So what this means is that the place of all the detector elements with respect to this precision is changing all the time. We don't actually know the exact position of the inner detector respective to the outer detector. We have to measure it all the time because it's moving with temperature, with all kinds of external conditions. So from the data we are collecting through tracks which go through the whole system, we are deriving continuously the whole internal geometry of each detector and to improve basically the precision of the measurement. And calibration is how we call this process. And as you can imagine, the middle part, the simulated data and the raw data are actually quite easy. They are just measurements, simple vectors of data types with positions. The inner part here, where you're combining a lot of objects from different pieces of the detector, that's a very complex object structure which has thousands of objects within one collision out of hundreds of classes which are pointing to each other. So it's a graph-like structure. And then from this kind of complex structure, we are deriving simpler tabular forms of the main quantities of an event, which is used by most of the 1,000 physicists to analyze the data, and really science is happening here. So simple, complex, and most of the people work with quite abstracted data towards the end. Maybe just quickly show this slide. In order to prepare the data so that we can actually store all of it, we have to do something quite early up in the process. As I mentioned before, there's millions of sensors. So if you would count the data amount which is coming out of each of the detectors, it would be a petabyte a second. So if you're just counting all the measurements in each part of the detector. So of course we cannot store that, and we don't want to store that. As I mentioned before, we only want to retain a small fraction of the data, only the interesting data. And we have a system which is based on which we call Trigger, which is analyzing in several levels what has happened. Is this interesting? There's some very fast levels which are based on customized hardware, basically, to take a decision whether this looks interesting. And then we have a complete farm of computers which is trying to reconstruct the whole event. And if it looks boring, we will throw it away. So this brings down our data rate from to basically 300 megabytes a second, which is the rate which we can store to disk. So only after this process we ever hit the disk. So all the other data, which we are not storing, well, we will never see it again. We just deleted it. So this is very important to understand, because deleting data, if you do a statistical analysis, is not something you can do easily, because it may introduce a bias in your measurement. So in fact, what we do, we don't delete all of the events which we wouldn't have taken. We delete most of them, but a small statistical subset we keep in order to prove that what we have deleted was actually, in fact, uninteresting and is not affecting the measurements which we are really doing. So that's how it works. From there, we collect from the trigger and data acquisition systems at each of the experiments. We collect the data, and you see the rates here. So we have small experiments with 50 megabytes a second, larger ones with, which were designed for 220 megabytes a second. And we have one special experiment, which is actually used only during 1 month during the year, when we are colliding heavy ions instead of protons. And during this mode, this experiment alone collects 1.2 gigabytes a second, because heavy ions are much more complex structures. They create events with many thousands of tracks inside the detector. So it's a lot more data. So these guys in 1 month collect as much data as the other guys the whole year. And I think there's some other numbers which are the numbers which we really measured. So these were the predicted ones, and of course every prediction is, if the system allows it, superseded by what can really be done. So all the experiments have tuned up the acceptance of events to as much as possible, and what we are doing, what we did last year was 400 to 500 megabytes a second, and during the heavy ion run we did 4 to 6 gigabytes a second continuous to storage, basically. So that's quite a data stream. I think I'm risking to get really slow. Let me speed up a little bit. Data volume I explained already. Very high rate, 15 petabytes of new data was predicted in the beginning. For the computing power to analyze this, the prediction was 200,000 CPUs would be required in order to reconstruct and analyze the data which is coming out of all of the experiments. So that's quite a big number. And 45 petabyte of disk storage would be required to serve all those CPUs at that time. So already in the beginning, basically around 2000, it was clear that CERN could not provide as a lab all this computing power. This is far beyond the budget, and therefore, basically from the start, the approach was to include computing resources from outside of CERN. So CERN today is providing 20 to 30% of the computing resources, and all the rest of the computing resources actually come from other labs, and I will show how this is working. Fine, I talked a lot about size, so this is showing basically how far in a double logarithmic plot the current experiments are away from what has been done before. So that's quite a gap there. I think there's some annotated numbers here which are showing how the prediction worked out. So the 15 turned into 22 petabytes per year and 30 in this year. The 200,000 CPUs turned into 300,000 CPUs based on the software performance and so on. And we have much more stored data storage than we did require. I'll have a very short bracket here talking about the software which we use to store this data, actually. So where do we put the data in? So what we tried basically when I joined, the whole project was still far away from deployment day, and I would call this a dream phase where everyone is thinking about how can we do the infrastructure much better than the last generation of experiments was doing it. And at that time, the first dream we had was, oh, we just put it, we have structured data, it's connected by pointers. Everyone was supposed to move from Fortran to C++ at that time, and it didn't happen yet. In '95 it was Fortran, but we knew it would end up in an object-oriented language, so we went for object databases. Well, it worked actually technically not too badly, but in contrast to what was predicted, that by the year 2000, object databases would take over the market, well, you know, they didn't. So by 2000, even though for us, some of the technology was working, we gave up on it because it's impossible for us to have a project for 10, 15 years if the market isn't there to support the technology which we need to implement it. So we gave up. We tried quickly object relational mapping, which was also not very successful because all the database vendors were telling us that C++ headers should be generated from SQL files, which didn't really match our many hundreds of developers which were developing C++ code at the time. and didn't really want to be driven by a data model of a relational database. So we gave up on that and use today a hybrid system which uses a relational database for keeping the metadata, the part which is concurrently updated, needs transactional consistency, but we keep the bulk of the data, the petabytes, we keep in structured files for which we wrote a persistency layer ourselves, which is using C++ introspection. Well, there's no C++ introspection, so we had to do one. So we are parsing header files. We are automatically creating the code which is mapping between the disk layout and the memory layout and store and read back objects which can point to each other. That's what this package is doing. But what I would like to mention here is that for me it's quite interesting to see NoSQL happening, because NoSQL is actually, to my mind, quite close to some of the concepts which have been there in earlier storage systems, for example, in object databases, like the handling of graphs in some of the systems. So we'll stay tuned. But for the moment, we are sitting with a petabyte on a storage system which we control and which we can move forward, which is very important as well, because we need to keep the data available. So for the infrastructure, which I mentioned before, how do we fill the gap between the infrastructure which we can provide centrally at CERN and the 300,000 CPUs which we need? So for this, we have a distributed infrastructure where CERN sits in the middle, collects all the data and archives it to tape. And from there, we immediately start sending out fractions of the data to 11 tier 1 sites. So the tier 1 sites are larger sites which are capable of running a tape infrastructure. So 1/11 of the data goes to each of them. So after it has arrived, we have 2 copies of the data, one on tape at CERN, one on one of the sites on another tape, so we can recover. And these guys, the tier 1 sites, they are serving 130, it's actually 140 tier 2 sites, which are smaller sites, which only provide CPU into the system and do not run a larger mass storage system. So this construction has allowed, at one hand, to bring data close to the clients, which are distributed all over the world, and there, of course, many of the analysis is latency sensitive, but also quite importantly has allowed to bring in funding into the project, because it's much easier to get funding in all the member state countries for labs which are existing already and for institutions which are existing already than saying, well, send us the money, we can do it cheaper in one place. So I think the grid solves both of these issues. The different tiers have different responsibilities. I mentioned the tier 1 already, so one of the additional responsibilities to permanent storage is the reprocessing of all the data. Once a new software release comes out for the reconstruction is happening on the tier 1s. The tier 2s, as they don't have any tape or large storage infrastructure, they do the large fraction of the simulation, because for simulation you don't actually need a lot of data on input, you're just throwing the dice basically, and we're collecting the files from them afterwards. Quickly to show you that this is actually used and not just on paper. So this shows how much CPU was delivered by the different players in the system, and you can see CERN is a little bit up here. Yes, we are providing 20%, but with this, the system would not work. That's completely clear. The other tier 1s provide a significant bit as well, but you can see all the big chunk here are various smaller and bigger tier 2 sites which are contributing to, CPU into the system, which get jobs submitted and deliver results back to the community. I'll skip this slide, I think, as I'm running a bit out of time. Well, I can't skip the other one, because this is shown the original model of data management which we had, which is basically the same tier model, now just annotated with how much network capacity do we need in order to ship the data through the system. And I don't want to go into too much detail, but the only thing I can tell you is that while we had some experience with the system, we are now changing somewhat the strategy from being a pure tree, as it was in the beginning, to be somewhat more complex. And this is because one of the ingredients of the system, the networking infrastructure, which we had to set up between all the sites, was working much better than it was predicted around the year 2000, when we came up with the original computing model for LHC. So now we have seen in production that these star kind of connections, which we have as dedicated fibers to all the big sites, the tier 1 sites, and also the internet around it, which is shipping the rest of the data to the tier 2 sites, is working much better and is cheap enough for us to use. So what we are doing now is to change the model slightly to make more use of the network and to have slightly less organized data transfers happening. So we are going from a strict tree hierarchy where CERN only sends to tier 1 only sends to tier 2, to a more flexible model where CERN sends to the tier 1 still for storing, but then between the tier 2s there's a lot of exchange, because you may have a job running at one tier 2 which needs the data which is actually sitting at your neighboring tier 2. So you can do two things: wait until the data has been pushed to you, this is a pure push model, or you can retrieve it across the boundaries of the tree. And that is exactly what we are going for. So the original model which we were using can be symbolized like this. So you have a tier 2, a tier 1, they're connected through some network. And what's really happening is data which is collected at tier 2 is stored on tape and retrieved from tape as needed. But there's an experiment workflow system which decides which data is now interesting, which data is popular enough to be sent to another site, and then there's a managed transfer system which keeps track of FTPs basically, but in a reliable way, and pushes the data out to the next layer, so tier 1, let's say, and from there, similar system. And the experiments themselves, they're controlling which data is on tape, on disk, and which data is moving upwards, but it's still a push system. More recently, we are going to a system which, on top of this infrastructure in the middle, also uses opportunistic lookups. So there's another layer which we are calling federation layer, where a client job, when it arrives at the CPU at the tier 2 site, when it finds out there's a file which I would like, but it's actually not there because it's currently unavailable because the storage element there is down or stuff like this, it will go through a hierarchy of redirectors which will, from the regional area back to the global area, forward the client to other places where this file may be at the moment. So that's a much less deterministic model, but it's a much more efficient model in basically the environment of lots of sites and a lot of disruptions. And I'm afraid, in the interest of coffee, do I still have? We can spend 5 more minutes. Okay, good. I'll just go through one other change which we are doing, and I think that is actually interesting. So what we started off with, basically in the 90s, was the idea that we always knew we cannot store all the data on disk because we cannot pay the spinning disk, we cannot pay the energy for the spinning disk either, and very important, culturally, our community doesn't like spinning disks because they know spinning disks are fast for analysis, but they're also fast for deletes and software mistakes to corrupt data. So the tradition in our area has been since long to go for tape. Now tape is awful. Tape is long, slow, comes with enormous latencies, but we have constructed systems which are hierarchical storage management systems, which simply means the user never talks to the tape directly. That has happened in the past, but luckily we got rid of that. But he rather talks to a system which has a large disk cache, and this system will go out and group requests and go to large tape libraries and fetch or store the files. So in theory, this is quite nice because to the user, we are showing a world which has all the files which have ever been taken just available. The job starts and then one of two things happens. Either the job runs immediately after a couple of milliseconds, or you wait 2 or 3 hours, because 2 or 3 hours is kind of the minimal latency we have to put between disk and tape in order to group sufficient requests to have a chance of getting more than one file from tape. We have a limited amount of tape drives, and going for a single file to mount a tape in a robot and to read a single file from the middle of the tape is very inefficient. So the story is simply there's a large latency which may or may not hit you. And while the original picture of HSM was nice, you don't have to know the details will optimize for you. It hasn't become true. We cannot optimize this away. The experiments, in fact, rather than using the internal optimization, they had to fool the system to force stuff to be on disk before they actually send the jobs. Because they have to be sure that when a job is starting, all the data is actually on disk so that we are not wasting CPU. And therefore, what has happened, we gave up on the dream. This HSM system for us does not work. The experiments can steer the data movement between tape and disk much better than a generic system in the middle who doesn't know about priorities of analysis and who doesn't know about which data files belong together actually can do it. And therefore, we are changing the model now to have independent pools. We have an archive pool, you get stuff from tape, and this is a well-managed central activity. And then there's an analysis pool, which is simply POSIX. You put files there, they're staying there until the experiment decides to change and delete data from there. And one of the systems which we have created just for pure analysis, which was started in 2010, I'm showing on here, so which is quite similar to Hadoop and Gluster in several aspects. We're doing file replication, all the metadata management for the many million files is done completely in memory without a database involved. And we are moving from the old system, the red part down here, to the new system. And as you can see, data is flowing during the operational phase from one technology to the next one, so we can still change. And I hope we'll be able to change also in the future. So sorry for running out of time a bit, but I'll stop here. Thanks.